Dylan Caro stood at the window of his daughter's hospital room, watching late light spill across the city in bruised orange and gray. Beyond the glass, rain threaded down the panes in slow, uneven lines, as if even the weather couldn't look away. Inside, machines kept time with soft, steady beeps. The bandages across Lena's cheek and eye didn't just cover wounds, they covered a future that had been ripped open. The surgeon had spoken carefully, like each word might cut someone else. Fractured bone, torn tissue, a long road, more than one operation, months of recovery. Mina sat beside the bed, both hands wrapped around their daughter's fingers as if holding tight could pull her back to yesterday. She hadn't cried in the last hour. Her eyes were red anyway, swollen with the kind of grief that doesn't always spill. Lena stirred. Her voice came out thin, blurred by swelling and medication. "Dad?" Dylan left the window and leaned close, forcing warmth into his face. "I'm here." She swallowed, winced, then tried again. "Is he going to jail?" The question landed in the room like a dropped glass. Dylan's jaw tightened. Mina's grip on Lena's hand turned fierce. "Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe the channel and let me know in the comments where are you watching from. It helps more than you know." Lena watched Dylan's eyes, not the bandages, not the monitors. She could read him. She always had. "He's not," she whispered, more statement than question. There was a knock. A uniformed officer opened the door just enough to gesture someone in. Behind him stepped Detective Thomas Rivas. Hard face, tired eyes, the practiced restraint of a man who'd seen too many families like this. Next to him was a woman in a charcoal suit with a folder held like a shield. Assistant District Attorney Priya Sethi. Dylan brushed a kiss to Lena's forehead. "Stay with Mom, okay?" He stepped into the hallway. Mina didn't look up. She didn't need to. She already knew what was coming. Priya spoke first, voice controlled, almost gentle. "Mr. Caro, I'm sorry." Dylan didn't blink. "Diplomatic immunity." Rivas's nostrils flared like he hated the words. Priya's eyes flickered down to her folder. "The boy's father is Consul Esteban Ibarra, attached to the Ecuadorian consulate. The immunity extends to immediate family members. The State Department won't authorize an arrest." "Won't," Dylan repeated quietly. "The best we can do," Priya continued, "is begin expulsion proceedings. That's paperwork, channels, delays. Weeks, maybe longer." Lena's muffled voice carried through the door. "Dad?" Dylan didn't answer her. He couldn't. Not with this in his mouth. Rivas leaned in, dropping his voice. "I was first on scene. I saw what Mateo Ibarra did. I saw him laughing while the paramedics worked. I'm telling you, man to man, don't do anything stupid." Dylan's gaze stayed level. "Stupid? If you go after him," Rivas said, "you'll be the one in cuffs, not him." Priya's expression softened with helpless anger. "I wish I had a different path for you." Dylan nodded once, as if accepting directions to a place he'd already decided to visit. "Thank you." He went back into the room and sat beside Mina without speaking. For a long time, the only sounds were the machines, the rain, and Lena's uneven breathing. Night took the city. The hallway lights dimmed. Mina dozed in the chair, still holding Lena's hand. Dylan watched the rise and fall of his daughter's chest until his eyes burned. Then he slipped out. The parking garage smelled of wet concrete and old oil. Dylan reached his car, an unremarkable sedan, dull paint, nothing that turned heads. He opened the trunk and shifted a spare tire kit. Beneath it, under a panel he'd installed years ago, sat an object he told himself he'd never touch again. A satellite phone. Bulky, outdated, untraceable. He stared at it like it might stare back. Dylan Caro was officially nobody. A consultant. A man with a mortgage and polite neighbors and a calendar full of harmless appointments. But that had been the cover he built after he left the work that couldn't be spoken aloud. In another life, he'd been deep inside the agency. Not the kind of job you brag about. The kind you deny so completely you start believing your own lie. Europe, logistics, access, wet nights and locked doors and favors that weren't favors. And Berlin. Back then there was a man in Berlin who didn't exist on paper. A fixer who cleaned problems when governments needed clean hands. People whispered a name they pretended not to know. They called him the Butcher of Berlin. Dylan picked up the phone. His thumb hovered over the power button. Inside the hospital, his daughter slept under bandages because a protected boy thought pain was entertainment. Dylan turned the phone on. A dull light blinked. The device hunted for a signal, old satellites answering like ghosts. When the bar steadied, Dylan entered a number from memory, one he'd never used, one he'd promised himself was buried with the man he used to be. The call rang. Once. Twice. On the third ring, someone answered with no greeting at all, only breathing, slow and measured. Dylan's voice came out in German, calm as ice. "The knives are still sharp." Silence. Then a voice, low and familiar, threaded with an accent that made Dylan's stomach tighten. "You kept my number for a long time." Dylan swallowed. "I need a debt collected." The voice didn't ask who. It didn't ask why. It only said, "Tell me the name." And as Dylan spoke it, Mateo Ibarra, he realized he hadn't just made a phone call. He'd opened a door. Behind him, the garage lights hummed, and far above, the hospital held his family in fragile stillness. On the line, Berlin listened. Berlin. Dylan Caro returned to the hospital before dawn. The city still wrapped in that quiet hour where nothing feels real yet. He slid back into the chair beside Mina just as the lights outside began to thin from black to slate. She stirred, her fingers tightening around Lena's hand as if waking reminded her what had happened. "You smell like rain," Mina murmured. "Garage," Dylan said softly. Couldn't sleep. She didn't press. She never had. Not about the parts of his past that came with locked doors and half answers. Lena slept on, breathing shallow but steady, the bandages rising and falling like a fragile shield. When the surgeon came later that morning, his tone was careful optimism. The swelling was stabilizing. The damage was severe but not hopeless. Reconstruction would take time, patience, precision. Lena nodded bravely through it all, her good hand clenched into the blanket. When the doctor left, she turned her head slightly toward Dylan. "He's gone, isn't he?" Dylan didn't answer right away. He chose each word the way he used to choose routes through hostile streets. "He can't come near you." "That's not what I asked." "No," Dylan said finally. "He isn't in jail." Lena closed her eyes. A tear slipped from the corner not covered by gauze. "I hate him." Mina inhaled sharply but said nothing. So did Dylan. By mid-morning, Detective Rivas returned alone. No suit, no folder. Just a man with something heavy pressing on his shoulders. "Off the record," Rivas said, leaning against the wall. "Consul Ibarra pulled his son out of the city last night. Private vehicle, diplomatic plates, headed north." "North where?" Mina asked. Rivas shook his head. "Doesn't matter. Once he crosses certain lines, we stop seeing him." Lena laughed, a short, broken sound that made everyone flinch. "So that's it." Rivas looked at Dylan. His eyes lingered there longer than they should have. "For now." After he left, Mina finally cried. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the slow, body-racking kind that comes when hope runs out of places to hide. Dylan held her, staring over her shoulder at the wall, replaying a voice from Berlin that hadn't raised or lowered in pitch once. By evening, the call came. Not to the satellite phone. To Dylan's regular cell. Unknown number. He stepped into the stairwell before answering. "Caro," he said. "You still sound like you're trying to be invisible," the voice replied. English, but clipped, controlled. "That habit will get you killed someday." Dylan closed his eyes. "You said you wouldn't use this line." "I said I wouldn't use it unless necessary. It is. Say what you need to say." A pause, then, "You gave me a name. I gave it attention. Where is he?" "Not where he thinks he is." Dylan's fingers tightened around the phone. "I don't want chaos." A faint sound crossed the line. Not a laugh. Something colder. "You didn't call me for chaos. You called me for certainty." Dylan pictured Mateo Ibarra's face from the police photos. The smile, the arrogance, the way Lena had flinched just remembering it. "What's the cost?" Dylan asked. "You already know," the voice said. "Nothing is free, not even silence." The line went dead. Dylan stood there long after the call ended, the concrete stairwell smelling faintly of disinfectant and dust. When he returned to Lena's room, Mina searched his face. "Was that the hospital?" she asked. "Yes," Dylan lied. 2 days passed. The news cycle moved on as it always did. Another scandal. Another storm. Mateo Ibarra's name appeared once briefly in a diplomatic column. An unfortunate misunderstanding. A regrettable incident. The consulate declined further comment. Lena began physical therapy. She hated it, loved it, both at once. Each small movement felt like proof she was still here. On the third night, Dylan received another message. This time it came the old way. The satellite phone vibrated once in his jacket pocket. He didn't answer it in the hospital. He waited until Mina fell asleep in the chair, until Lena's breathing deepened. Then he stepped outside, the air sharp and metallic against his lungs. He powered the phone on. "You're late," the voice said immediately. "I was with my family. That is why you called me." Dylan swallowed. "Tell me what you've done." "Your problem," the man said, "has been separated from his protection." "Is he alive?" "Yes." Dylan didn't know whether that answer relieved him or not. "He is altered," the voice continued, "removed from the idea that he is untouchable." A memory flashed in Dylan's mind. Berlin, a basement room, a lesson delivered slowly, carefully, so it would never be forgotten. "And his father?" Dylan asked. Another pause, longer this time. "Consul Ibarra will learn, not tonight. Fear needs time to ripen." Dylan closed his eyes. He could stop this, he could say it now, he could tell the man in Berlin to walk away. Instead he asked, "What do you need from me?" "Nothing yet," came the reply. "Go back to your daughter. Be seen. Be ordinary." The line clicked off. Inside, Lena shifted in her sleep, her brow furrowing like she was fighting something invisible. Dylan sat beside her and took her hand, careful not to disturb the bandages. He told himself this was about protection, about balance, about making sure some lines could not be crossed without consequence. But as the city settled into darkness again, Dylan understood something he hadn't before. Whatever Berlin was setting in motion, it was already moving on its own now. The news broke just after sunrise. A jogger had found a man near a riverside service road, half hidden beneath overgrowth where the city forgot to look. The anchors didn't use names at first. They never did when diplomats were involved. They spoke in careful phrases. Critically injured, under investigation, no immediate threat to the public. Dylan watched the broadcast from the small television mounted in Lena's hospital room. Mina stood beside him, arms folded tight across her chest. Lena listened without looking, her gaze fixed on the ceiling tiles like she was counting them. Then the name appeared in a lower third banner, Mateo Ibarra. Mina exhaled slowly as if she'd been holding her breath for days. "What happened to him?" The reporter hesitated, eyes flicking to something off camera. "Authorities are declining to specify the nature of the injuries, citing the ongoing investigation." Lena turned her head slightly. "Is he dead?" "No," Dylan said too quickly, then softer. "No." Detective Rivas arrived an hour later. His suit was gone again, replaced by a jacket that had seen better years. He closed the door behind him, glanced once at Lena, then faced Dylan. "They found him alive," Rivas said. "Barely." Mina's voice was flat. "Who did it?" Rivas shrugged. "Whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. No witnesses, no usable footage, gloves, masks clean." His eyes stayed on Dylan as he spoke. Dylan met his gaze evenly. "You think it's connected?" "I think," Rivas said carefully, "that the universe has a strange sense of timing." Lena laughed under her breath. "Good." Rivas flinched at the sound. "He's never going to hurt anyone again," he said quietly. "That much I can tell you." Mina closed her eyes. Rivas lingered another moment, then added, "Consul Ibarra is making noise. Loud noise. Claims this is retaliation, claims threats." "And?" Dylan asked. "And," Rivas said, "public sympathy isn't on his side. We've already uncovered 2 prior incidents overseas, same pattern, same excuses." He straightened. "If anyone asks, you were here all night." "We were," Mina said immediately. Rivas nodded once and left. That night, the satellite phone vibrated again. Dylan didn't answer it right away. He sat with Mina and Lena, listened to the nurse explain post-op plans, nodded through discussions about scarring and therapy. When both of them finally slept, he stepped into the empty family lounge and answered. "You saw the news," the voice from Berlin said. "Yes?" "Then you understand restraint." Dylan leaned against the wall. "You promised he'd live." "He does." "And his father?" A pause, thin as a wire stretched too tight. "Fear has begun." Dylan pictured Consul Ibarra waking to the news, seeing his son broken, realizing immunity was not armor, only delay. You're escalating, Dylan said. I am educating, the voice replied. Your systems failed. You called me because you knew that. Dylan closed his eyes. This ends soon. All things end, the man said, some cleanly, some screaming. The line went dead. 2 days later, Consul Esteban Ibarra disappeared. Not dramatically, no witnesses, no alarms. He left his residence in the early morning, dismissed his driver, and walked toward a transit hub he never reached. His diplomatic security detail raised the alert by afternoon. By evening, the story was everywhere. Mina stared at the screen in disbelief. People don't just vanish. Dylan said nothing. Federal agents arrived before midnight. They were polite, thorough. They asked where Dylan had been, who he'd spoken to, whether he'd received any threats. Mina answered most of the questions. Nurses confirmed Dylan had been at the hospital during every relevant window. Phone records showed nothing unusual. The agents left unsatisfied. Lena spoke after they were gone. Dad, she said quietly, did you do something? Dylan sat beside her bed. He took her hand, careful of the IV line. I made sure you're safe. She studied his face for a long moment. I don't care what happens to him, she whispered. I just don't want to be afraid anymore. You won't be, Dylan said. But that night, as he lay awake in the chair beside Mina, his phone buzzed again. Unknown number. He answered it without speaking. You owe me, the voice said calmly. Dylan's stomach tightened. For what? For resolution. For closing the circle. I didn't ask you to. You asked for certainty, the man interrupted. This is certainty. Silence hung between them. There will be a time, the voice continued, when I call again, when I ask for something small, information, access. You will remember tonight. Dylan swallowed. And if I refuse? A faint sound crossed the line. Not amusement, not anger. Then the past will stop staying buried. The call ended. Dylan stared at the dark screen, feeling the weight of a door he'd opened and could no longer see behind. Outside, the city hummed on, unaware. Inside the hospital room, his daughter slept more, peacefully than she had in weeks. And Dylan understood with sudden clarity that protecting his family had bound him to something that did not forget debts easily. The call didn't come for a week. Dylan began to hope it wouldn't come at all. Life at the hospital slipped into a fragile routine. Lena started to sit up on her own. Physical therapy sessions turned from agony into progress. Small victories measured in degrees of motion and minutes without pain. Mina brought in clothes from home. Familiar smells meant to remind their daughter that there was still a world beyond antiseptic halls and white noise. The city moved on, but the shadow stayed. Consul Ibarra's disappearance became an international inconvenience rather than a priority. Press conferences hardened into talking points. Diplomatic language smoothed over what fear couldn't explain. Eventually, the story thinned out, replaced by something louder, something easier. Dylan knew better than to believe that silence meant safety. The satellite phone vibrated just after midnight on the 8th night. He didn't hesitate this time. He slipped into the stairwell and answered. You are visible, the voice from Berlin said. That is good. Dylan leaned against the concrete, eyes closed. Say what you want. There is a judge, the man said. In Harbor City. Dylan opened his eyes. No, you haven't heard the rest. I don't need to. The voice remained calm, unbothered. This judge signs orders that inconvenience us. He asks questions that slow things down. I'm not doing this, Dylan said. I called you for my daughter. That debt is paid. A pause, longer than before. Debts, the voice replied, are not paid when you decide they are paid. Dylan felt the old instincts surface, sharp and unwelcome. You said nothing yet. And now it is yet. The stairwell felt suddenly too narrow. I won't help you hurt an innocent man. Innocent, the voice repeated as if tasting the word. You Americans are very attached to that idea. Dylan's jaw tightened. I'm done. Another pause, then softly. We know where Lena will continue her recovery. We know where Mina parks her car. Dylan's breath stopped. This is not a threat, the man said. This is a reminder of proximity. The line went dead. Dylan stayed there long after, the phone dark in his hand, the echo of Berlin's certainty pressing in on him. He had known this moment would come. He had just hoped it would come later. He didn't tell Mina that night. He watched her sleep instead, the rise and fall of her chest anchoring him to something human. The next morning he made a different call, not to Berlin, to an old contact, who had never existed on paper, a man who'd once shared bad coffee in worse places and still owed Dylan a favor he'd never wanted to repay. The voice on the other end was cautious. "You're not supposed to be alive. Neither are you," Dylan replied. "I need help." There was a long silence. Then, "That depends on what kind. The kind that keeps my family breathing." The man exhaled. "You always did have a way of complicating things." Dylan didn't smile. Over the next 2 days, Dylan listened more than he spoke. He gathered fragments, patterns, names that surfaced once and never again. He confirmed what he already suspected. Berlin didn't work alone. By the 3rd day, federal agents returned. Different ones this time. Quieter, sharper. They asked about the satellite phone. Dylan told them he didn't own one. They asked about Berlin. Dylan said he'd never been. They left without pressing further, but Dylan saw it in their eyes. Curiosity edged with warning. That evening, Lena surprised him. "Dad," she said as he adjusted her blanket, "if someone hurt him, the boy who did this, would that make them bad?" Dylan hesitated. "It would make them complicated." She nodded slowly. "I think I understand complicated now." He kissed her forehead and stepped out before she could ask anything else. The satellite phone rang again that night. This time, Dylan answered with his decision already made. "I won't touch the judge," Dylan said, "but I can give you something else." The voice from Berlin did not respond immediately. "There is an internal review," Dylan continued. "A leak. Someone feeding information you shouldn't have. I can help you close that door." Silence stretched. Finally, the man spoke. "You are offering to betray someone else instead of yourself." "I'm offering you stability," Dylan said, "and a clean exit." Another pause, then, "You think very highly of yourself. I think very highly of my family." The voice softened just slightly. "You have 48 hours. Prove you are useful." The call ended. Dylan slid the phone back into his pocket, pulse steady now. The fear hadn't gone away, but it had sharpened into something else. Resolve. Because if Berlin thought he was cornered, it had forgotten one thing. Dylan Caro had survived the agency by knowing when to step forward and when to set a trap that looked like surrender. The 48 hours Berlin gave him passed in silence. No calls, no messages, just the constant awareness that he was being watched by people who didn't need eyes to see. Dylan used the time the way he always had. Quietly, methodically. He mapped routines, compared timelines, cross-checked fragments he'd collected from old contacts who spoke in half-sentences in favors long overdue. The picture that emerged wasn't clean, but it was clear enough. Berlin had grown careless. Success had done what enemies never could. It had made them predictable. The leak Berlin worried about wasn't internal in the way they assumed. It wasn't a traitor inside their circle. It was exposure, patterns in movement, reuse of safe corridors, a belief that the old ways were still invisible. Dylan recognized it immediately. He'd made the same mistake once long ago and paid for it with bodies. On the second night, the satellite phone vibrated. "You have something," the voice said, not a question. "Yes, speak." "You're being mapped," Dylan said, "not by locals, not by police, by a joint task force that doesn't exist on paper. They're not chasing you, they're waiting for you to move." Silence stretched. This time it wasn't calculated. It was concern. "You're wrong," the voice said finally. "I'm not," Dylan replied. "You reused a Berlin corridor twice. You mirrored a Prague route. You assumed diplomatic blind spots still hold." Another pause. Deeper now. "Why tell me this?" the voice asked. "Because if they move first," Dylan said, "you won't even know who pulled the trigger." The line crackled softly. "Proof." Dylan sent coordinates, timings, a name that hadn't been spoken aloud in 10 years. When the voice returned, it was quieter. "You still remember how to read shadows." "I never forgot." "What do you want?" Dylan didn't hesitate. "My family off your board. Permanently." "And the judge?" Untouched. Silence again. Finally, "You overreach." "No," Dylan said, "I finish." The call ended without agreement. 3 hours later, Lena woke screaming. Not from pain, from memory. Mina held her as she shook, whispering reassurance that felt too thin for the fear clawing its way out. Dylan stood uselessly by the bed, rage and guilt tangling in his chest. When Lena finally slept again, Mina turned to him, eyes sharp despite exhaustion. "You're carrying something," she said. I don't know what it is, but it's in this room with us. Dylan sat beside her. I won't let it touch you. That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give. The knock came just before dawn. Not loud, not urgent. Two men stood in the hallway. No badges visible, no threats spoken, their posture said enough. We'd like a word, one said. They didn't accuse. They didn't threaten. They asked questions that circled too close to truths Dylan had buried. They mentioned Berlin without naming it. They mentioned a judge without saying why. When they left, Dylan knew the clock had shifted. That night, the satellite phone rang again. You were right, the voice from Berlin said. No preamble, no pride. They moved. I told you they would. 2 of my people are gone. Dylan closed his eyes. Then listen to me now. A pause. Speak. You end this, Dylan said. You step away. You disappear like you should have years ago. And you leave my family out of your stories. And in return, I give you what you need to vanish cleanly. The voice was quiet for a long time. You think you are bargaining, the man said slowly, but you are standing in a storm pretending to direct the wind. Maybe, Dylan replied, but storms don't last forever. A sound crossed the line, not laughter, something closer to respect. You have changed, the voice said. So have you. The silence that followed felt final. Then, there will be no more calls, the man said, if I keep my word. And if you don't, Dylan's voice was steady, then you won't get another chance to. The line went dead. For the first time since the hospital room, Dylan felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief, not yet, but space. 2 days later, the news reported a firefight overseas. Vague, disconnected, no names that mattered. Federal attention shifted elsewhere, and the satellite phone stayed silent. Dylan locked it away anyway, because some instincts never sleep, and because deep down, he knew this story wasn't finished yet, only paused, waiting to see if promises made in the dark could survive the light. 5 years passed, not quietly, but steadily, like a river that had flooded once and then learned its banks. Lena healed. The scars never vanished completely. Thin lines traced her cheek and the edge of her eye, visible only when the light caught them just right. At first, she tried to hide them. Then she stopped. By the time she returned to university, she wore them the way survivors sometimes do, not as proof of pain, but of endurance. She studied law, then advocacy. She spoke to rooms full of strangers about loopholes, power, and how justice sometimes failed the people who needed it most. When she talked, people listened. Not because she was angry, but because she was precise. Mina went back to work. The nightmares came less often. When they did, she woke Dylan without explanation, and he held her until the shaking passed. They never spoke about Berlin. They didn't need to. Dylan kept his promise. He never touched the satellite phone again. He returned to a life that looked boring from the outside. Consulting, committees, long walks that went nowhere in particular. But beneath it all, he stayed alert in the way men like him never fully unlearn. The agency never called. Neither did Berlin. Officially, the disappearance of Consul Esteban Ibarra was filed under unresolved diplomatic anomalies. Mateo Ibarra was extradited quietly years later, after immunity no longer shielded him. He stood trial without cameras. The sentence was long, final. No one asked Dylan Caro for a statement. Detective Thomas Rivas made lieutenant. They crossed paths once at a grocery store. Rivas nodded. Dylan nodded back. Nothing else passed between them. One autumn evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky the same bruised colors Dylan remembered from the hospital window, a package arrived. No return address. Inside was nothing but a single sheet of paper. One sentence. Debts closed. No signature. Dylan burned it in the sink and washed the ashes away. That night he sat on the porch while Mina cooked inside and Lena laughed on the phone with friends. The sounds drifted through the open window. Ordinary, precious, irreplaceable. Dylan thought about the man he had been, the one who believed control meant safety, the one who had dialed a number he swore he'd never use, the one who learned that monsters never come without a cost. He also thought about the man he had become, a father who crossed a line once, and then spent years making sure no one else had to. He didn't pretend he was innocent. He didn't pretend he was proud. But he knew this much with certainty. When the system failed, he had chosen his family, and he would make that choice again, every single time. The past stayed buried, the future stayed open, and the wolf, if it still existed at all, no longer hunted his house. And if you've been listening this far, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching from. It helps more than you know.